Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'm going to be answering your questions from the Battlespace episode Raptor Rising. Obviously quite an important episode and also quite an interesting episode, I think everyone would agree, and some interesting questions and topics to discuss. So without any further ado, let's get right into it and start talking about it. So, first question is from Harper Steele. Why can I not pronounce order more naturally? So first things I want to say is that I think Harper, you and all the other voice actors involved in the episode did a terrific job. Every single one of them. I've had comments from some people saying that they kind of prefer the older style of Battlespace episode with less quotes and it's just me. And I think those have their place, certainly, and if you're into that, ultimately people like what they like. But I do like working with different voice actors because I think they lend an air of legitimacy and reality to what it is I'm depicting. And in Raptor Rising, we actually have this sort of two contrasting experiences being portrayed. We have the Romulan admirals and Romulan leadership and their desires and ambitions and politics, as compared to the Cardassian civilians who we see sacrificed on the altar of Romulan ambition and Romulan warfighting ideology. And I think having the voice actors to actually give voice to that is extraordinarily helpful. So I thank you, everyone, all of you, not just those who helped in Raptor Rising, but those who have helped in all the other Battlespace episodes. I think it's very key to how the quality of these stories has gone up over the years. You know, people keep telling me in the comments my storytelling capabilities have gone up, but I think a lot of that is also just tied to I have this amazing community around me that's helping me out and that's helping me bring out the detail where once I could have only expressed it through narration, now we can express it in, dialogue. So next set of questions is actually a couple of questions from HMS Vanguard, Mara Firewing, Invictus, Alexander Leach, all of which were asking, is this a historical parallel to XYZ, Dresden, Sherman's March on Atlanta, which is American Civil War, so I don't really know, the firebombing of Japan? And the answer is, well, yes, fairly obviously. I can't really say that it's not, but what I would also say is that I've always kind of worried about this Apocalypse series because my episodes always seem to have this very unfortunate timing where when I conceive of and start writing them, they seem to be about topics that are quite remote and far away, and then suddenly they're really, really not, and that's quite that's quite disconcerting. But I think that's also valuable, because it means that we have this allegory through which we can more comfortably discuss what are extremely emotive and difficult to discuss topics, especially on YouTube. This does provide a lens for a more open discussion, when we're talking about Cardassians and Romulans. It's a lot easier than talking about even World War II, or indeed even more recent stuff. And so, yes, I would say that it is certainly an allegory, but that it's an ongoing allegory, and I'm not really seeking to pontificate a certain point of view. The episode is certainly about a certain thing, but equally, if you take the episode in a more broader context with all the other Dominion War content that I've made, it then becomes just a small snapshot, and while it is detailed, we also see the broader war and actually what are the more decisive factors in the broader war. As to regards, when it comes to talking about, did the strategic bombing of Germany help win World War II? And we would say absolutely. Did it win World War II? No. The only point in history I would arguably say a bombing campaign has basically won a war single-handed is Desert Storm, but that was a very particular and unique set of circumstances that nobody's really fool enough to replicate again in such a way as we've seen. We're never going to see another Desert Storm because that was such a devastating lesson for everyone that, that's not going to happen. And that's the thing with the Romulan doctrine as pontificated by Admiral Xerix, is that, he wants that Desert Storm moment. That's what he's after. He's after that sweeping victory. It's a lot more complicated than that. And also, there then comes an interesting comment, and then there comes an interesting comment there on historical correlation versus causation. So, for example, Italy in World War I could arguably say at the end of World War I that they beat the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that is arguably partially why they then came to resent the other World War I allies, because they got nothing after the war. They felt that their victory had been betrayed, and then the rest is history. However, it ignores the larger, broader historical context of the fact that the Austro-Hungarians had spent most of their energy fighting the Russians, and the Russians did considerable amounts of damage to the Austro-Hungarian army, and then really it put such pressure on the Austro-Hungarian Empire that it collapsed internally. You can argue how much weight the Italian offensives in 1918 had, but I think it would be fair to say that it certainly wasn't the Italians all on their own that brought down the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and everyone knew it. But as far as the Italians were concerned back then, they had just toppled the Austro-Hungarian Empire and would like a little bit of respect, thank you very much. And that's a kind of a similar potential thing, is that, well, soon after, the war ends in a few more months, and so Admiral Xerix could say, look, I did the thing, that was me. When in fact, there was a whole bunch of other things that happened, namely actually marching in. And then also, I point out Desert Storm, it wasn't the air campaign that drove out the Iraqis from Kuwait, it was the ground troops. And the ground troops still fought, it wasn't like a complete steamroll, there were casualties. The enemy still continued to put up a fight, but certainly you could say that the heavy lifting of that campaign was the air campaign, but, no one can win a war single-handed. Next question is from Bloody Simile. This is actually a couple of suggestions for Dominion War episodes, or other Battlespace episodes. One of them is for the Maki Conflict, and then the other one is the Dominion Massacre of the Gamma Colonists. That would be on New Bajor. I'm not so keen on the Dominion Massacre of New Bajor, just because we don't see it, and we know so little about that colony that it's not much to talk about, really. The Maki Conflict is absolutely a very important and critical thing to talk about, and if people are interested in me talking about it, there are definitely aspects which I want to discuss. It's hard to discuss the entire thing because, while it's actually quite small scale, because it's an asymmetric campaign, it's harder to break it down in terms of battles and actions and maneuvers. It's sort of more attritional and ongoing than that. What I would be happy to talk about is the end of the Marquis. The end of the Marquis, when the Jem'hadar comes sweeping in and just annihilate them, because I also think, again, in terms of more recent history, that's a very pertinent and important thing to remember. Next question is from Fighting Falcon. What is the difference between the numbered legions like the 4th, 6th and 9th legions and the named fleets? So, all of these are just different legions. Some are numbered and that's their title. Others have obtained over the years nicknames, such as Firebirds, Black Legion, Praetorians, but they're all numbered. It's just some of them have gone beyond using those numbers. Formally, they are still a numbered legion, but no one calls them that. And then in terms of, what the difference between them is, they're their own independent fleets, and they operate completely separately a lot of the time, maybe in close cooperation with one other, and potentially they have a history with them as well. And each of them have their own particular culture, history, and esprit de corps, and what are the things that they value. So, for example, the Firebirds value, devastation, overwhelming firepower, whereas the Black Legion values stealth, cunning, and subterfuge, so on and so forth. I'll be doing a members-only video on that, just because I don't think that will necessarily get a huge amount of traction more broadly, but I will leave that for the members. Next question from Shannon Carter, actually 3 questions. Were commanders Dinatra, Suran, and their 2 conspirators, Bezor and Talik, present in the campaign, or were they conveniently elsewhere and keeping their hands clean? So, in respect to this particular question, Commander Dinatra would have been in command at this time of a Raptor-class warbird, probably in the 9th Legion. She was involved actually back in the episode, she actually appeared back in the episode Raptor's Revenge, launching raids on Dominion outposts near Romulan space. And yeah, she has continued to serve throughout the war as a Raptor commander and has done very well, really distinguished herself, and so post-war will get command of one of the new Near-Exons. As for Suran, it's unclear where Suran is, but I would suspect he maybe already is in command of a Near-Exon, of one of the first Near-Exons. More likely, he is probably operating in close collaboration with the Remans troops. I suspect that Commander Suran and a few others staked a lot in getting the Remans into the war and organising those forces, their training, their equipment, their transport, and their deployment. And then that does raise the next question, which is also, were Shinzon and his Remans forces involved? So, by this point in the war, which is late 2375, absolutely they were. But in terms of their involvement in this particular campaign of raiding, no, because the Romulans are just raiding. They are, by this point, using the Remans as ground troops, and I will be doing a dedicated Dominion War special episode about the Remans regiments. Originally, when I was sort of conceiving of this episode in my head, I thought I could weave in the Remans regiments and talk about that as well, but I think you'd agree that there isn't really enough space in this episode to talk about both the Remans and the Romulan raiding campaign in a satisfactory manner, so I think I will do that as a Dominion War special, and you will be seeing that coming down the line very soon. Did the campaign allow for the rise of Praetor Hiron and Senator Teloro to their roles by the time of Nemesis? I basically don't know, because I know very little about Praetor Hiron or what he did during the war. I know that there's various beta canon sources, however, I'm very hesitant with a lot of beta canon sources because they get very funky, they can be very strange, so I don't really want to comment on Praetor Hiron. Certainly suffice it to say that the war very much worked in favour of the military castes of the Romulan Empire, those military families in the Senate. They definitely benefited from the war, as opposed to the sort of more elite, purely political, senatorial, patrician families. Next question is from the Pope of Simps. As to the initial fleet commander who denied the use of next-gen warbirds in the Near-Exon, is there a deeper meaning to having Imperial markings? So this is regarding Admiral Velik refusing to take command of the Near-Exons because they weren't painted green, because they were just launched so quickly. In terms of that, in terms of the importance of Imperial markings, it's both a cultural and a military thing. You've got to remember that Velik is in command of the Praetorian Legion. He has not only the best of the best in his fleet, but he is also, very high up the pecking order back on Romulus, politically speaking. Taking these sort of rough and ready ships is a sort of a sign of that's below me, and actually I don't need these fancy pants new warbirds. I'm quite good with what I have. And then the other half of it is that the green livery that most Romulan ships have at this time does play a small part in the stealth aspects of Romulan ships. This bleeds really into colour theory and photography. You will notice actually that I reused in that episode a lot of shots that were first taken during the Battle of the Giants, What I did, however, is I retreated those pictures. I brought up the brightness so that a lot more of the ships were visible. But it's because it's very, very easy to darken Romulan ships. If they didn't have all those windows on the hull, it would be very difficult to have them in anything but very bright lighting, because they just sort of disappear. And that's really the nature of Romulan green. It sort of eats light. And I think that probably does then factor into the in-universe aspects of it, where it's some kind of light-absorbent hull material. It's not super important to the cloaking device, but it is a key component. And there is, I think, a reason there why both the Klingons and Romulans converge on a sort of greenish colour for their ships, and I think it does play a part in improving stealth capabilities. Next question is from Geekius Maximus. Why didn't the Dominion attempt to push further into the northernmost sector during November and December? Even with the deployment of Klingons to the north, there's still basically 3 Dominion fleets that could easily attack a single Klingon lone fleet up there at Algolia Prime if they really wanted to, which could then help them outflank the Allied front in the north. Why didn't they? Lack of confidence, logistical issues, Federation sabotage? Just wondering. I know it sounds nitpicky, but I'm genuinely curious about what other difficulties the Dominion was having at this point besides the Romulan and the Cardassian rebellion. So, that is actually a very interesting question. Basically, it boils down to not overextending beyond your own lines of support. So the first thing to bear in mind with this is that while you see 3 Breen fleets on the map, that's actually a misnomer. The Breen fleets have actually been broken up into smaller division-sized units, so basically into quarters, and those are going around supporting the various other Cardassian and Jem'hadar fleets, mostly Jem'hadar at this point. It's also interesting to note that there are no Breen on the southern front, which then raises an interesting problem for the Dominion, because yes, they could extend and take Algolia Prime and just overwhelm the Klingons, but this kind of happens before, where you then end up with a salient, and it's going to be very difficult to support. Another key thing to bear in mind is also the Dominion have not completely forgotten the fact that the Romulans exist, so if they leave too much of a gap between their frontline units and their supply lines, that's a gap into which the Romulans can attack. So if they extended, maybe even past Algolia Prime, as far as Tesnia or Morkin, or all the way up to Gaza Prime, that's a large area to be covered in depth. So basically, the greater depth your advance has, the more likely it is that the Romulans are going to find a gap into which they can attack and interrupt your lines of communication and lines of support, which then means when you get double-teamed by 2 enemy fleets, you can't actually do anything about it because the Romulans have intercepted the people who would be coming to help you. The other thing to bear in mind is also that Breen aren't exactly that robust. So again, they're very hesitant to throw the Breen into attacks anywhere that there are Klingons. And at the same time, because the Breen aren't robust, the Jem'hadar can't actually advance with that much confidence. Because also, all the Klingons will be waiting for is just for the Breen to show up, they kill the Breen, and then the Federation and Romulans can come in and happily engage the Jem'hadar without being taken out by energy dampers. So it's a complex situation, and I think that the final issue is just supply. They've now got to supply the Breen, and that's quite difficult because they've been under blockade for upwards of a year now, and they're on a war economy, and, overall, the situation economically and logistically speaking isn't great. Not to mention, particularly, that acts of sabotage, or you might say deliberate incompetence within not just the Cardassian military, but also bearing in mind the Cardassian merchant fleet, also is probably playing a key factor in slowing the supply down. At this point in the war, most Cardassians are probably quite happy to say, enough's enough. We've secured our territory, we're fine, our homes are safe, we don't really want to go on another invasion of the Federation. So the Cardassians are going to be dragging their feet, and similarly, so is their civilian merchant navy going to be dragging their fleet. And ultimately, it is that merchant fleet that the Dominion relies upon. And then going all the way back, you can again go back to that thing of, well, they still know that the Romulans are out there, and that hasn't changed. If you're a Cardassian merchant ship, do you really want to be, going out into space that isn't 100% secure and fortified when you know that there are Romulans out there? I think there's a great multitude of factors as to why the Dominion does not advance during December and November of 2375. It's not just the Klingons, although they would probably have you believe as such. Next up is from Jesse Wilson. Was wondering how you came to your casualty figures. I would have thought they would have been in the millions at least. So, yeah, casualty figures in Star Trek is always a strange thing because the writers don't seem to understand the scale of galactic war. What I will basically say in regards to the way I came about my estimation of about 400,000 was I literally wrote down all the colonies, took a rough guess about the size of the colonies, and then rough percentages of casualties depending on the severity of the attack. The thing to bear in mind there is that you need, really for any colony, you need at minimum 5,000 people in order for it to have a viable population that can reproduce indefinitely. And so you have this sort of baseline, and then from that you go, okay, well, how significant is this colony? How important is it to the war effort? What's being done there? And that's a very critical thing to bear in mind. What is being done there? How developed is the world? Is it a primary resource extraction site? Is it an agricultural site? Is it a processing industrial site? Is it a logistical hub? Communications, all these things, economic centers, so on and so forth. I could go on ad nauseum. But what that is to say is that you're going to have different populations depending on what the economies of those areas are. So I took that into account as well, and that's then how I came about these casualty figures. I won't go through the calculations because, again, they are approximate estimates, but to go up into the millions is excessive, very difficult to do that, particularly in just singular raids, especially one of the things you've got to think about when you're fighting space wars in any setting, but Star Trek as well, is that a lot of worlds aren't super duper populous. Yeah, you've got your core worlds, which are inhabited by billions, but generally that even caps off still at about 10 billion, because Star Trek is relatively utopian. And it's like, well, yeah, Earth can probably support more than 10 billion. I mean, we're there now, and the world is still here. We're not all dying from famine. It seems to be working pretty well, so arguably, like somewhere like Earth, a major capital world, could probably do as high as 20 billion, no problem. But once you start moving out even a single parsec or 2 parsecs, your populations are just going to become more and more diffuse, because space is big, and there's lots of different things that different populations want to do. So that's a very long rant about colonists and relative planet sizes, but all that is to say is that when you're bombing anything other than basically planetary capitals, you are going to see immediately less casualties because they're just less densely packed, because most of the time people have only been living on them a couple hundred years, as opposed to places like Earth where people have been living for millions of years and thus have had time to build up quite large populations. Next question from Species STO. At 4 minutes, you have a map that is explained as what the Romulans were originally thinking could be the newly carved up Cardassian space post-victory of the Alliance. I'm curious how you arrived at who gets what in that map, and it's also interesting to see that Bajor getting several systems to expand into a much larger nation. Also, what are your thoughts on how the map would almost certainly ensure future conflicts? It's like World War I divided Europe, and that's simply going to blow up into World War II. Well. Firstly, I would dispute that it's even competently done as World War I Europe, because this is much more like the Scramble for Africa, where we have nice straight lines, because that's how borders work. As we all know, if you give people nice straight borders, they'll happily abide those, and definitely that won't cause ridiculous border disputes, because straight borders are silly. In terms of who gets what, largely it's based on who needs the most industrial resources, who's got what are the best sort of lines of communication, and also there is still provision there for a free Cardassian state, but it's largely based upon where people's forces currently are, and, bearing in mind, this is a Romulan estimation, and, so there's going to be certain biases in place here. In terms of the idea of a larger Bajor, I think that would actually be something that would be bipartisan approved. I think the Romulans are also very keenly aware that the Klingons would like to seize a lot of industrial resources, so they've seized Menorah and Tavak. The Federation, obviously, they had a historical dispute with the Cardassians over the area that was then known as the demilitarized zone, and so it's likely that they'd take that, and also just sort of better fortify going a little bit further into Cardassian space. That's where they perhaps anticipate future confrontations with the Federation. But as far as the Romulans are concerned, this is actually quite manageable, because in between them and the Federation, because in between them and the Klingons, who, let's bear in mind, the Romulans hate the Klingons, is the Cardassian state. So there's a nice little barrier there between the Klingons and the Romulans to prevent them fighting. If anything, the Romulans would probably prefer it if there was also a barrier between themselves and the Federation, maybe going from Sarpedion, Prashaka, Trekla to Kelrabi, and thus sort of giving them a bit of buffer there as well. But then that would lose them a lot of territory, and the Klingons get a lot, but that's largely due to their pre-existing positions. And so it's a little bit of realpolitik. In terms of its potential to cause future conflicts, yes, almost certainly. And that then breeds a final conclusion, which is another interesting point, which is there are some bits of fan fiction that talk about a conflict between the Romulans and the Federation shortly after the Dominion War, some point in the 2380s. In fact, the Star Trek The Final Frontier fanfiction series, from which I originally discovered the Romulan Kirchen class, depicts such an event, and I don't think it would be a particularly unlikely outcome. If you were the Romulans, actually, a divided Cardassia is quite a nice thing to have, because if you wanted to have it out with the Federation, you now have this safe place to do so. You say, we won't cross the neutral zone, and we won't attack the Federation directly, but we will fight over Cardassia with you. And that would perhaps be an ideal scenario. Of course, it would inevitably spiral out of control disastrously. So, final question from Dion King. After the Dominion War, can you do a new series on the war between the Typhon Pact and the Khitomer Accords? Since it was skipped in Picard, and that means it's no longer canon, but you can do whatever you want with it, and the placement of the factions makes it interesting. Okay, I've never read this book. It's somewhat interesting. Would the Romulans readily make an alliance with the Breen? Maybe. The post-war world is an interesting one, and on one level I'd like to discuss it, but on another level I think it's also just nice to leave that, somewhat open. And also, not to just do what STO has done, which is make the 24th, which is just add war after war after war after war in endless succession. It's like, how is any of these states still standing after decades of war with the Federation and the Klingons and the I don't even know what else, because I don't know STO that well, but I know well enough that there is a lot of wars in STO, and I don't think that's necessarily helpful or interesting. You can do the Dominion War once, but, at that point, I think even everyone is sort of like, that's enough. What I do think is interesting is to look at a revived Romulan Cold War with the Federation, which is even readily admitted to in DS9 that there will be a resumption of the Cold War. That old Thor is probably gone now. Both have seen each other's capacity to make war, and that will inevitably create more tension. And additionally, the taboo of making interstellar war has kind of been broken, so why not keep going, sort of thing. So I think that's a potential flashpoint, and that could be interesting. As regards other states here, like the Breen Confederacy, the post-war Breen would be very interesting, largely in terms of how do they operate in the Alpha Quadrant? Have they become a pariah? Are they sanctioned to hell and back? What do the Tholians do? You know, the Tholians, the ultimate neutral. I mean, getting the Tholians to join anything is impressive. The Gorn are actually interesting because obviously at some point between the Dominion War and STO, the Gorn are annexed by the Klingons, or the Gorn state is brought into the Klingon state. And I quite like that turn. I think it makes an awful lot of sense. It keeps the Klingons interesting, and maybe it was a way of staving off the decline of their empire. A bit like how the Austrians sort of rejuvenated their empire by going it from the Austrian Empire, or Holy Roman Empire, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the twin kingdoms of Austria-Hungary, and giving the Hungarians a more prominent place within that alliance. And I think that's very interesting, because the Hungarians are the vastly cooler part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I think that's an interesting bit of history to talk about as well. The sort of formation of a new state between the Gorn and the Klingons. Was it peaceful? Was it violent? You know, what was going on there? That'd be quite interesting. And then what's the impact for the rest of the quadrant? The Zenkethi are interesting. However, really, in order to get a proper assessment of the Zenkethi, I'd like to look at some of their earlier history in terms of their wars with the Federation. And indeed, all those little wars of the early 24th century are quite interesting. Obviously, we've looked at the Cardassian border war, but at the same time, or very similar time, you have the Talarian war, otherwise known as the Galen border conflict, and you have the Zenkethi conflict. And then also, what's also interesting to note is that in some fan canon, and I do quite like this given their relative proximity, both the Talarians and Zenkethi at different points have been to war not only with each other, but also with the Cardassians. And I think particularly in terms of getting to understand the Cardassians as we then meet them in the 24th century, looking at those conflicts could be very, very helpful indeed. So, I suppose that's all to say that, yes, I have not run out of ideas. Rest assured, there is plenty more on the way. So, thank you all for watching, thank you for your wonderful questions, thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarchs, Tully DT, David Reeves, Rella, and Macross Schaffer. My loyal commanders, Philip Ty, Bird Monster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narrator, Nathaniel Mead, Adam Bowman, Gabe Logan, DM Tribal Typhoon, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Joe G, You Don't Know Trek, and Scotty O. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okokatum Questo, John Nicole, Athletes Collection, Tobias Klein, Greg Martin, Marzarine, Bird of Play D3, Jamal Soto, and Khan the Skektal Overlord. And I thank all my sub-lieutenants, and I welcome Fizz Walker and Dwayne McLean. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.